Ethan's heart pounded as he scrolled through the receipts. Boutique hotels, luxury dinners, weekends unaccounted for. Mia's secrets unraveled like a thread pulled too far. Rage bubbled when Rachel's photographs confirmed it. His wife and her husband entwined in a betrayal so profound it made his stomach churn. At the coffee shop, Rachel's revelation burned the final thread of doubt. Ethan's perfect world was a house of cards, collapsing under the weight of deception. With fire in his chest, he plotted a response that would echo louder than their lies. But first, where are you watching this from? Comment below. And if you love these stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. The sunlight streamed through the gauzy curtains, casting golden patterns on the hardwood floor of Ethan's suburban home. Outside, the neighborhood was alive with a quiet hum, the distant laughter of children playing, the low murmur of lawnmowers, and the occasional chirp of birds perched in the sycamores lining the street. It was a quintessential American morning, one that should have been the hallmark of peace and contentment. To anyone peeking in from the outside, Ethan's life seemed perfect. Sitting by the bay window, Ethan cradled a steaming cup of black coffee in his hands. The warmth seeped through the ceramic, grounding him in the moment. His gaze wandered over the manicured lawn, the freshly painted picket fence, and the glinting silver SUV in the driveway. This was the life he'd worked so hard to build. A life of order, success, and stability. From behind him, the familiar sound of soft footsteps broke his reverie. "Coffee's ready." Mia's voice floated in, light and melodic, like a song he'd always known by heart. Ethan turned to see her standing in the doorway, holding her own cup of coffee, her auburn hair glowing in the morning light. Dressed in a cream-colored sweater and jeans, she looked effortlessly beautiful, the kind of beauty that didn't try too hard, but still took his breath away. He smiled, setting his cup down on the windowsill. "Thanks, honey." She crossed the room, her steps quiet against the hardwood, and kissed him on the cheek. "What are you thinking about?" "Nothing much," Ethan replied. "Just how lucky I am." Mia chuckled softly, her lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, don't let it get to your head." He laughed, the sound bouncing off the walls of their immaculate kitchen. Everything in their house was curated and pristine. Mia had an eye for detail. From the carefully chosen wall art to the minimalist decor, their home radiated an air of control and perfection. It mirrored their lives, or so Ethan believed. Mia sipped her coffee and leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone absent-mindedly. Ethan watched her, a sense of gratitude welling up in his chest. She was more than his wife. She was his partner, his best friend, and the woman who had been there through every high and low. And yet, there it was again, that faint tug in the back of his mind, like the whisper of a shadow in a well-lit room. He tried to shake it off, telling himself he was imagining things. But no matter how hard he tried, it lingered, a feeling he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. But there were cracks in every mirror, weren't there? He thought, taking another sip of his coffee. You just had to look closely enough. Something wrong? Mia's voice cut through his thoughts, her tone light but curious. Did you? He looked up quickly, masking his hesitation with a smile. No, nothing. Just thinking about work. She nodded, though her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary. Well, don't overthink it. You've got enough on your plate without stressing over things that haven't happened yet. Ethan nodded, her words meant to comfort him. Still, they felt strangely hollow, as if she were the one hiding something, not him. He brushed the thought away again. This was Mia. She wasn't just his wife. She was the embodiment of trust, the anchor that kept him steady. Why would he ever question her? As Mia set her coffee cup in the sink and headed upstairs, Ethan turned back to the window. The perfect morning stretched out before him, undisturbed, but deep down he knew perfection was a fragile thing. One wrong move, one hidden truth, and it could shatter completely. Ethan knew better than to be too happy. The world had its shit too, or not. He closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the warmth of the sun on his face, trying to hold on to this feeling, this life, just a little longer. Because once a mirror cracks, it's never the same again. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting to the past, to the moment his world first collided with Mia's. He could still see her vividly, standing in the corner of the bookstore, flipping through a tattered copy of The Great Gatsby. Her laugh, light and unguarded, had echoed across the room when a stranger bumped into her, nearly toppling the tower of books at her feet. It wasn't just her laugh, it was her presence. Magnetic, effortless. Ethan had been mesmerized. He found himself walking over, pretending to browse the same shelf just to have an excuse to speak to her. "Looking for something specific?" she'd asked, tilting her head with a curious smile. And that was it. One smile, one shared moment, and the trajectory of Ethan's life had forever changed. Over time, Mia became more than the beautiful girl in the bookstore. She became his anchor, his partner in every sense. Her confidence and warmth filled every room she entered, her presence lighting up even his darkest days. He smiled at the memory, tracing the rim of his coffee cup. Their romance had been the kind that felt like it was written in the stars. Those early years were filled with laughter, road trips, and late-night talks where the hours seemed to vanish in an instant. Mia had a way of making him feel invincible, like together they could take on the world. Transitioning into marriage had only deepened his admiration for her. She was brilliant in every way that mattered, quick-witted, compassionate, and fiercely independent. When Ethan struggled in the early years of his career, Mia had been the one to push him forward, believing in him when he doubted himself. "I married the best of us," he often told her. And every time, she would roll her eyes playfully, pretending to dismiss the compliment, even though he could tell she loved hearing it. But lately, something was different. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but they're all the same. It wasn't in the big gestures. They still shared dinner every night, still kissed goodbye every morning. It was in the small things, the spaces between moments, where something felt off. This morning, for instance. As Mia leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone, Ethan couldn't help but notice the faint furrow in her brow. Her expression was unreadable, but her fingers moved quickly across the screen, typing out a message. He hesitated, then spoke up. "Anything interesting?" he asked lightly, nodding toward her phone. Mia glanced up, her eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second too long before looking away. She locked the screen and slipped the phone into her pocket. "Just work stuff," she said, her tone breezy but rushed. Ethan nodded, trying to shake the unease that had settled in his chest. It wasn't the first time she'd brushed something off like that, but it was the way she did it. Too casually, too quickly, that gnawed at him. Later, as he walked through the house, Ethan found himself lingering in the hallway where their wedding photos hung. His gaze landed on one in particular, Mia laughing, her head thrown back, with Ethan looking at her like she was the only person in the world. It had been one of those candid shots the photographer had captured without them noticing, but it had become his favorite. As camera rolled, he kept saying to himself, "Sweet little girl, we were lucky to meet you." He ran his fingers along the edge of the frame, the memory of that day flooding back. For a moment, the unease in his chest was replaced by something warmer, softer. Whatever was bothering him, whatever small cracks he thought he'd seen, he was sure it was just his mind playing tricks on him. They were solid. They always had been. But as he turned to leave the hallway, a shadow of doubt followed him, small, faint, but impossible to ignore. That evening, Ethan met Jake at their usual spot, a cozy bar tucked away on a quiet street downtown. The dim lighting and soft hum of conversation provided a sense of privacy, the perfect backdrop for their regular catch-ups. Jake, always the more outspoken of the two, was already seated in their usual booth, nursing a glass of whiskey. Ethan slid into the seat opposite him, greeting his friend with a nod. "Rough day?" Jake asked, raising an eyebrow as Ethan signaled for a drink. "Not really," Ethan replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "Just tired." Jake smirked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Man, you've got it all. Great job, great wife, great house. But don't take your eyes off the ball." He paused, his expression growing serious. "People change, Ethan. Even the ones you think never will. Ethan frowned, caught off guard. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, Jake said with a shrug, though his tone suggested otherwise. Just saying, life has a way of throwing curveballs when you're not looking. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his drink arriving just in time to give him an excuse not to respond. Jake had always been blunt, but there was an edge to his words tonight that unsettled Ethan. He dismissed it, chalking it up to Jake's usual cynicism. Look, the conversation lingered in Ethan's mind as he drove home, the quiet hum of the car engine doing little to drown out Jake's words. When he walked through the front door, the house was dark except for the faint glow coming from the kitchen. Mia was at the counter, her laptop open, her face lit by the screen. "You're up late," Ethan said, stepping inside. Mia looked up, startled. "I didn't hear you come in," she said, closing the laptop quickly. "I'm just finishing up some work." Ethan approached, leaning against the counter. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, just a lot going on," she replied, avoiding his eyes. "Actually, I might have to go on a last-minute trip this weekend. Work stuff. They need me to meet with a client in Chicago." Her words were casual, but there was a stiffness in her posture that made Ethan hesitate. "Chicago?" he repeated. "That's sudden." "It is," Mia said, finally meeting his gaze. Her smile was there, but it didn't feel quite right. "But you know how it is. I'll only be gone for a couple of days." Ethan nodded slowly, not wanting to push. "All right, let me know if you need help packing." Mia chuckled softly, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I've got it covered, thanks." She kissed him goodnight, but as her lips brushed his cheek, it felt mechanical, like a habit rather than affection. Ethan tried to dismiss the thought, telling himself he was being overly sensitive. The next morning, Ethan was tidying up while Mia packed upstairs. As he emptied her purse, something caught his attention. A small slip of paper sticking out from one of the pockets. He pulled it out, his brow furrowing as he read the bold print at the top. The Rosewood Boutique Hotel. The receipt was dated 2 weeks ago. For a weekend, Ethan distinctly remembered Mia being out with friends. His heart sank, a knot tightening in his stomach. Why hadn't she mentioned staying at a hotel? And why this one? The Rosewood was known for its luxury and romantic ambience, not exactly the kind of place you'd expect for a girl's night out. Ethan folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into his pocket. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. He wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation, that Mia would laugh and brush it off as something innocent. But deep down, that shadow of doubt had grown darker, heavier. When Mia came downstairs, suitcase in hand, Ethan forced a smile. "Ready for Chicago?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "Yeah," she said, her smile bright but her eyes distant. She kissed him goodbye, and once again, it felt hollow. As the door closed behind her, Ethan stood in the quiet house, the receipt burning a hole in his pocket. Something wasn't right, and no matter how much he wanted to ignore it, he couldn't shake the feeling that the cracks in their perfect life were widening. The days after Mia's trip to Chicago felt off. Ethan tried to brush it away, tried to immerse himself in work and routines, but the unease lingered. It wasn't anything glaring, no loud arguments, no overt shifts, but the small, quiet changes had a way of gnawing at him. It started with her phone. Mia had always been quick to respond to messages, but now it felt different. Her laughter was no longer shared. It was private. She started smiling at her screen more than she smiled at him. One night, as they sat in the living room, Mia's phone buzzed. She picked it up quickly, her fingers dancing across the screen as she typed back. Ethan watched her, trying not to let his curiosity show. "Funny group chat?" he asked, his tone light. Mia glanced at him briefly before focusing back on her phone. "Just work stuff," she said, her voice clipped. Work. It was always work. Ethan nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that the air between them had shifted. She was right there, but somehow she felt far away. And it wasn't just the phone. Late nights became more frequent. Mia, who had always preferred winding down early with a book or a show, suddenly had endless projects to finish. She'd come home hours after dinner, offering vague explanations. "Sorry I'm late," she'd say, setting her bag down and kissing him on the cheek. "We had a client meeting that ran over." Ethan would smile and nod, but inside, questions churned. Every time she walked through the door, she seemed a little more distant, a little less present. And every time he asked about her day, the answers felt thinner, as if she were reciting lines from a script. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, the silence between them grew louder than the clinking of silverware. Ethan decided to test the waters. "You've been busy lately," he said, keeping his tone casual. "Anything exciting?" Mia paused, her fork hovering over her plate. "Just the usual," she replied, her voice just a beat too quick. "Why?" "No reason," Ethan said, forcing a smile. "Just wondering if there's something new going on." She laughed, but it sounded forced. "Nothing new, just work keeping me on my toes." The conversation ended there, but Ethan couldn't let it go. He replayed her words in his mind, dissecting every tone, every pause, every flicker of her eyes. The doubt that had been simmering now began to boil. Over the next few days, Ethan found himself noticing more. The way Mia would leave the room to take calls. The way her bag seemed heavier when she came home, as if she were carrying something she didn't want him to see. And always, the way her smile seemed off. Her phone buzzed again one morning as she was getting ready for work. She picked it up quickly, turning slightly away from him as she read the message. Ethan, watching from the kitchen, saw the faint smile cross her lips. "Who's that?" he asked casually, his voice carrying across the room. "Just a reminder for a meeting," Mia said without looking up. She placed the phone face down on the counter and headed upstairs to grab her shoes. Ethan stared at the phone, a tightness forming in his chest. Whispered, smiled, turned away. The pattern repeated in his mind like a drum beat. That night, as Mia worked late again, Ethan sat alone on the couch, the TV playing in the background. He couldn't focus on the show, his mind racing with possibilities. He hated the thoughts swirling in his head, hated the way suspicion clawed at him, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. He picked up his phone and began scrolling through their shared calendar, searching for anything that might explain the sudden changes. Her trip to Chicago was marked, but nothing else seemed out of the ordinary. No client names, no meetings that lined up with her late nights. Ethan set his phone down and rubbed his temples. He wanted to trust her. He needed to trust her. But trust was built on transparency, and right now, Mia felt like a locked door. The next morning, Mia was bustling around the kitchen, packing her lunch for the day. Ethan decided to try again, his tone light but probing. "You've been working so hard lately," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Anything big coming up?" Mia smiled briefly but didn't meet his eyes. "Just the usual grind," she said, brushing past him to grab her bag. "I'll see you tonight." She kissed him quickly and left, the door closing softly behind her. Ethan stood there, staring at the empty space where she'd just been, the sound of her car starting up echoing in his ears. Something was wrong. He didn't know what it was yet, but the distance between them wasn't imagined. It was real and it was growing. The idea gnawed at Ethan for days before he finally gave in. He hated himself for even considering it, tailing his own wife like some paranoid fool. But the questions wouldn't stop, and the distance between them kept growing. Every vague excuse, every hurried text, every forced smile had built up into a wall he couldn't climb over. So, when Mia mentioned another late meeting one Thursday night, Ethan made his decision. His heart pounded as he watched her leave the house, her heels clicking against the driveway, the taillights of her car disappearing into the night. Sitting in his SUV, parked a block away from her office, Ethan gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The air inside the car felt heavy, suffocating, as if his doubts were taking up all the space. His rational side screamed at him to go home, to trust Mia, to stop this madness, but his gut wouldn't let him. Something was wrong, and he needed to know the truth. He glanced at the dashboard clock. 7:45 p.m. Mia had been gone for nearly an hour. He tapped his fingers against the wheel, the rhythm echoing in the stillness. The longer he sat there, the more his doubts multiplied. Finally, his phone buzzed, a text from Jake. 1. How's everything, you good? Ethan stared at the message for a moment before shoving the phone back into his pocket. He couldn't answer that question. Not now. Not until he knew. At 8:10 p.m., headlights appeared at the end of the street. Ethan's pulse quickened as Mia's car came into view. She slowed near her office building but didn't stop. Instead, she drove past it, merging back onto the main road. Ethan hesitated for a split second before starting his engine and pulling out behind her. His stomach churned as he followed at a cautious distance, his eyes locked on her taillights. "Don't do this," his conscience whispered. "Go home." But his gut screamed louder. "What?" The streets grew quieter as Mia drove into a different part of town. The office buildings gave way to smaller shops and dimly lit cafes. Ethan's heart raced as he watched her turn into the parking lot of a small, upscale restaurant. She parked, checked her phone, and stepped out of the car. Ethan pulled into a spot several spaces away, his breathing shallow. From his vantage point, he could see her clearly as she adjusted her coat and walked toward the entrance. She paused briefly, glancing at her phone again before stepping inside. Ethan sat frozen for a moment, his mind spinning. Maybe it was innocent, a client dinner perhaps, or a last-minute meeting, but why hadn't she mentioned it? Why not tell him? "Who the hell is she meeting?" he muttered, his voice low, almost as if he didn't want to hear the answer. He waited for what felt like an eternity, the minutes dragging by. Then the door to the restaurant opened and Mia stepped out, laughing. She was with a man, tall and well-dressed, his hand brushing lightly against her back as they walked. Ethan's chest tightened, his breath catching in his throat. Who the hell is he? His thoughts raced, each one more painful than the last. Just a coworker? Or something worse? The man said something, and Mia laughed again, the sound carrying faintly across the parking lot. Ethan's jaw clenched as he watched them walk toward the man's car. They stood by the driver's side, close enough that their shoulders touched. The man opened the door for her, and she hesitated for a moment before sliding inside. Ethan gripped the steering wheel so tightly it felt like it might break. His mind screamed at him to get out of the car, to confront her, to demand answers, but his body wouldn't move. He sat there, paralyzed, watching as the man got into the car and drove away with Mia. The drive home was a blur. Ethan's thoughts spiraled, a chaotic mix of anger, confusion, and betrayal. He replayed the scene over and over, searching for clues, for anything that might explain what he'd just witnessed. But no matter how hard he tried, the image of Mia laughing with that man refused to leave his mind. By the time he pulled into the driveway, his hands were trembling. The house felt cold and empty as he stepped inside, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. He sat down at the kitchen table, his mind still racing. Maybe it's nothing, he told himself. Maybe it's work. Maybe. But the doubt was too loud, too persistent. Ethan leaned forward, his head in his hands, as the cracks in his perfect life grew wider. For the first time, he truly felt the weight of what he might lose. Ethan barely slept that night. The image of Mia with the man at the restaurant played on a loop in his mind, each repetition sharpening the edges of his anger and confusion. By morning, he felt raw, a knot of tension coiled in his chest. He couldn't let it slide, couldn't bury it under excuses or silence. When Mia walked into the kitchen, freshly showered and humming softly, Ethan's stomach twisted. She looked so normal, so unbothered, as if nothing had happened. He waited until she poured her coffee before speaking, his voice tight but controlled. "We need to talk," he said, his words cutting through the quiet. Mia turned, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "About what?" "Last night," Ethan said, his eyes locked on hers. I saw you." Mia froze for a moment, her mug halfway to her lips. Then she set it down carefully on the counter, her expression shifting into one of cautious calm. What do you mean? I followed you, Ethan admitted, the words feeling heavy as they left his mouth. I saw you at that restaurant. With him. Her eyes widened briefly before narrowing, her tone sharp. You followed me? Ethan, what the hell? Does he— Don't turn this around on me, he snapped, his frustration bubbling over. Who was he? Why didn't you tell me you were meeting someone? Mia crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. It was a business meeting, she said, her voice clipped. A last-minute client dinner. I didn't think it was worth mentioning. Ethan's eyes narrowed, his voice rising. A client, really? Then why did it look so personal? You were laughing with him, Mia. You got into his car. Her eyes flashed with anger. Because I knew you'd overreact, Ethan. This is exactly why I didn't tell you. You're acting paranoid over nothing. Nothing? Ethan echoed, incredulous. You expect me to believe that? Yes, because it's the truth. Mia's voice grew louder, her frustration matching his. You followed me like some kind of stalker, and now you're accusing me of— What? Cheating? God, Ethan, do you even hear yourself? Ethan took a step back, his breath coming in shallow bursts. Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were too smooth, too rehearsed. It felt like she was trying to flip the script, to make him question his own reality. This isn't about me, he said, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. It's about you, and you're hiding something. Mia shook her head, grabbing her bag from the counter. I don't have time for this. Believe whatever you want, Ethan. I'm done having this conversation. She walked out the door, leaving him standing alone in the kitchen, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Ethan stared at the empty space where she'd stood, his anger giving way to a deep, aching void. Her words hung in the air, echoing in his mind. You're acting paranoid. Believe whatever you want. The next day, Ethan's thoughts were no clearer. He spent most of the morning pacing the house, replaying their argument in his head. Every word she'd said felt calculated, designed to deflect and dismiss. He wanted to believe her, wanted to let it go, but the doubt wouldn't leave him. When he finally decided to leave the house, he found something waiting for him. Tucked under the windshield wiper of his car was a small, folded piece of paper. His heart raced as he picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded it. Line. The words were written in neat, precise handwriting, each letter deliberate and steady. Ethan's pulse quickened as he scanned the empty street, looking for any sign of who might have left it. But there was no one, just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant hum of a passing car. He stared at the note, his mind racing. Who would leave this? And how did they know? The questions piled up, each one more unsettling than the last. Sliding into the driver's seat, Ethan clenched the note in his fist. His gut twisted with a mix of vindication and dread. If someone else thought Mia was lying, it meant he wasn't crazy. But it also meant the truth, whatever it was, might be worse than he imagined. He leaned his head against the steering wheel, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The cracks in his marriage, once small and hidden, were now wide open for the world to see. And Ethan knew he couldn't ignore them any longer. Ethan sat in the corner of the coffee shop, his foot tapping nervously against the tiled floor. The note was folded in his pocket, its weight as heavy as the questions swirling in his mind. The sender had texted him from an unknown number that morning, asking him to meet here. He didn't know who to expect. Some stranger with a vendetta? Or worse, someone who would confirm his worst fears. At exactly 2 p.m., a woman walked in, scanning the room before her eyes landed on him. She was tall, with sharp features and a no-nonsense air about her. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, but the weariness in her eyes betrayed a story of her own. Without hesitation, she approached his table. "Ethan?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with tension. He nodded. "And you are?" "Rachel," she said, pulling out the chair across from him. She sat down, her movements brisk and deliberate, and placed a leather-bound notebook on the table. "I'm the one who left the note." Ethan leaned forward, his chest tightening. "What's going on? Why did you leave it? How do you know Mia?" Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment she said nothing, as if deciding how much to reveal. Then, with a sigh, she opened the notebook and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the table. Ethan stared at the image. It was Mia and the man from the restaurant, standing far too close, their expressions far too intimate. "That's my husband," Rachel said, her voice trembling but growing stronger. "James." Ethan's stomach churned. He glanced back at her, his throat dry. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because it's not just your marriage she's wrecking," Rachel snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. "James and I have been married for 12 years. I thought we were happy, but then I started noticing things. Late nights, secretive phone calls, excuses that didn't add up." Ethan's hands clenched into fists on the table. "And you think Mia's involved?" "I don't think," Rachel said, her tone hard. "I know." She pulled out another photo, this one of Mia and James leaving a hotel together, their hands brushing as they walked. Ethan felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. His chest tightened and his vision blurred around the edges. "They've been seeing each other for months," Rachel continued, her voice rising. "I hired a private investigator when I couldn't stand the lies anymore. I didn't want to believe it, but the proof is right here." Ethan stared at the photo, his mind struggling to process the images in front of him. He felt hollow, like his insides had been scooped out, leaving only a fragile shell. "Why are you telling me this?" he managed, his voice barely audible. "Because I thought you deserved to know," Rachel said, leaning forward, her anger crackling like static electricity. "No one deserves to be lied to like this. No one deserves to be made a fool of." The coffee shop seemed to blur around them, the sounds of clinking cups and quiet conversations fading into the background. Ethan felt like he was drowning, every word Rachel spoke pulling him further under. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice trembling. "A few weeks," Rachel admitted, her tone softening slightly. "I've been trying to figure out what to do. At first, I thought maybe I could confront James and end it quietly. But then I saw her, Mia, the way she looked at him, the way they acted together. It's not just some fling. They're playing with our lives." Ethan shook his head, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "This doesn't make sense. Mia and we've been fine. Sure, there've been some rough patches, but nothing like this. I thought we were okay." Rachel's expression hardened. "That's what I thought too. But people can hide things, Ethan. They can make you believe everything's perfect while they tear it apart behind your back." "Yes?" Ethan's mind reeled. He thought of all the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the excuses. It all fit, but he didn't want it to. He didn't want to believe that the woman he loved, the woman he trusted more than anyone, could do this to him. His experience with the FBI had shown him that people trusted people too far to help, although they often just guessed. "She told me it was work," he said, more to himself than to Rachel. "Every time. Work meetings, client dinners." Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "That's the go-to excuse, isn't it? James said the same thing. Work's been busy, honey." Turns out he wasn't working late. He was meeting her. Ethan clenched his jaw, his emotions swirling into a storm of anger, disbelief, and pain. "What do you want me to do with this?" he asked, gesturing to the photos. "Confront her? Burn it all down?" "That's up to you," Rachel said, her voice steady now. "But if you want the truth, you'll have to face it head on. She's not going to admit it unless you make her." As Rachel stood to leave, Ethan remained seated, staring down at the photos. His mind was a blur, his emotions a tangled mess. Rachel's anger was palpable, a fire that burned bright and fierce. But Ethan? He felt empty, as if the betrayal had hollowed him out completely. "She's lying, Ethan," Rachel said, her voice softer now, "and you deserve better than this." Without another word, she walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Ethan alone with the truth laid bare in front of him. The betrayal he'd tried so hard to deny was now undeniable, and he knew there was no going back. Ethan sat in the living room, the envelope with the photos resting on the coffee table in front of him. The weight of it was unbearable, a physical presence pressing down on his chest. He heard the sound of the front door opening and Mia's keys jingling as she set them down. Her voice called out, light and casual, as though nothing had changed. "I'm home," she said, walking into the room. The smile on her face faltered the moment she saw him. His expression, the tension in his shoulders, the envelope, it all stopped her in her tracks. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice cautious. Ethan didn't answer right away. He motioned to the envelope. "Sit down," he said, his tone low and controlled. Mia hesitated, her brows knitting together. "Ethan, you're scaring me." "Sit down." The command in his voice left no room for argument. Slowly, she lowered herself onto the couch opposite him, her eyes flicking between his face and the envelope. "What is this?" she asked, reaching for it. Ethan stopped her hand. "You tell me," he said, his voice sharp. "Because I already know." Her hand froze, her face paling slightly. "I don't understand." "Stop lying, Mia." Ethan's voice broke, and for a moment, the mask of control he had been wearing slipped. "I know about you and James. I know everything." Mia's mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked at him, her eyes wide like a deer caught in headlights. "Ethan, I followed you," he interrupted, his words cutting through hers like a knife. "I saw you with him." And then Rachel filled in the rest. Mia's face crumpled, and she pressed her hands to her mouth. "Rachel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, Rachel," Ethan snapped. "Your lover's wife. She showed me the photos, Mia. She told me how long this has been going on, how long you've been lying to me." Tears welled up in Mia's eyes, and she shook her head, as if denying it would make it untrue. "Ethan, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" he demanded, standing up, the photos clenched in his hand now. "Explain how you betrayed me, how you lied to my face? Go ahead, Mia, explain." She sobbed, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Ethan laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and hollow. "You didn't mean for it to happen? That's your excuse?" It just happened," she said, tears streaming down her face. "At first it was nothing, I swear, just talking, I don't know, feeling seen. But then you slept with him," Ethan finished for her, his voice cold. "Don't sugarcoat it, Mia. Don't insult me more than you already have." Mia broke down completely, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she sobbed. "But you stopped seeing me, Ethan. You stopped seeing me." Ethan froze, her words hitting him like a physical blow. "Don't you dare blame me," he said, his voice rising. "Don't you dare try to make this my fault." "You don't understand," Mia cried. "I've felt so alone for so long. You're always working, always somewhere else, even when you're here. And James, he listened. He made me feel like I mattered." Ethan stared at her, his chest heaving with anger and disbelief. "So what? That justifies this? You couldn't talk to me? You couldn't tell me you were unhappy? Instead, you go behind my back and destroy everything we built?" Mia shook her head, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I was wrong, Ethan. I know I was wrong, but I didn't know how to fix it. And then it was too late, and I was scared." "Scared?" Ethan's voice cracked, his emotions spilling over. "You should be scared, Mia. You broke us. You broke me." The room spun around him, her words hitting him like punches. Every excuse, every apology, every tear felt like a dagger, twisting deeper into his chest. This was it. The moment their life shattered. "I loved you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I trusted you. And you threw it all away. For what? For him?" Some of the laughter had Pastor Pike's expensive research. Mia reached for him, but he stepped back, the hurt in his eyes stopping her cold. "Ethan, please, I love you. I still love you. He shook his head, the tears he'd been holding back now spilling over. "You don't do this to someone you love, Mia. You don't." The silence that followed was deafening. Mia sat on the couch, her sobs quieting, while Ethan stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. He didn't know how long they stayed like that, the distance between them growing wider with every passing second. Finally, he turned back to her. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," he said, his voice hollow. "But I know one thing for sure. Things will never be the same." Mia looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, but she said nothing. What could she say? The damage was done, and no amount of words could undo it. Ethan walked out of the room, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the house. The life they had built together was in ruins, and neither of them knew if it could ever be rebuilt. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt oppressive, like a weight pressing down on every corner. Ethan sat alone at the dining table, the confrontation with Mia still replaying in his mind. Her tears, her excuses, her hollow declarations of love, they all clashed with the images of her with James, laughing and intimate, as though their marriage meant nothing. Ethan rubbed his temples, the throbbing ache in his head relentless. He needed answers, clarity, something more than her broken apologies. Pulling his laptop closer, he opened their joint bank account, a thought nagging at the back of his mind. If Mia was hiding one life, could she be hiding more? The numbers on the screen blurred for a moment before they came into focus. Ethan scrolled through the transaction history, his heart sinking as he spotted several unfamiliar charges: boutique hotel stays, high-end restaurants, extravagant purchases at luxury stores, none of which he recognized. His stomach churned. Clicking through the details, the pattern became clear. The dates lined up with Mia's late nights and work trips, the same periods she'd claimed were for business. But the truth was stark and undeniable. She wasn't just spending time with James. She was spending their money, siphoning it away piece by piece. Ethan's chest tightened as he opened the ledger of their savings account. The balance was lower than he'd remembered. Much lower. A cold realization washed over him as he compared the figures. Thousands of dollars were gone, unaccounted for, drained slowly over the past few months. The theft wasn't random. It was calculated. "God damn it," he whispered, his voice breaking in the stillness of the room. He sat back in his chair, staring blankly at the screen. Betrayal was one thing, a dagger to the heart, a wound that might never fully heal. But this was something deeper, darker. It wasn't just betrayal, it was theft. It was a complete erasure of everything they'd built together. Ethan's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. The hotels weren't just places to meet James. They were sanctuaries for their deceit. The extravagant charges weren't accidents or indulgences. They were investments in a life Mia was building without him. A flash of anger surged through him, hot and blinding. He clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening. Everything he had worked for, every sacrifice he'd made to provide them with a stable, comfortable life, it had been used to bankroll her betrayal. "I trusted her," he thought bitterly. "I trusted her with everything, and she destroyed it." The ache in his chest grew heavier as another thought crept in. How long had she planned this? Had this been a gradual fall, or had she decided long ago that Ethan's love and their life together weren't enough? The questions burned, each one cutting deeper than the last. Ethan closed the laptop, unable to look at the damning evidence any longer. He stood and paced the room, his footsteps echoing in the hollow silence. The weight of it all, Mia's lies, the loss of their trust, the financial betrayal, pressed down on him like a vice. For years he had believed in their partnership, in the idea that they were a team. They'd built a life together, brick by brick, through late nights and hard work. But now he saw the cracks, the rot that had spread unnoticed beneath the surface. It wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the realization that she had dismantled their life together, piece by piece, while he had been too blind to see it. As the night wore on, Ethan sat in the living room, his mind spinning. He thought of Rachel's words, of her anger and fire. "They're playing with our lives," she'd said. At the time, he'd thought she was being dramatic, but now he understood. It wasn't just about love or passion. It was about the lies and the destruction left in their wake. Mia had turned their marriage into a facade, a mask to hide her duplicity. And now, as Ethan stared into the darkness of their empty home, he realized there was no going back. Their life wasn't just broken, it had been erased, stolen from under him. His voice broke the silence, low and bitter. What else did she take? Ethan sat across from his lawyer, the sterile office filled with the faint hum of the air conditioning. The desk between them was cluttered with papers, legal forms, financial disclosures, and a checklist of things that needed to be sorted out. It felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unravel from a distance. He kept waiting for the moment it would feel real, but it never came. "Ethan," the lawyer said gently, pulling him from his thoughts, "we need to go over the next steps. This isn't going to be easy, but it's important to stay focused." Ethan nodded, though his stomach churned. "Let's just get it over with." Thanks. Filing for divorce was the hardest decision Ethan had ever made, but it was also the only one that made sense. The trust was gone, the foundation of their life shattered. As much as it hurt, staying would have meant living a lie, and Ethan couldn't do that to himself. Still, knowing it was the right decision didn't make the process any easier. Every meeting with the lawyer felt like another wound reopening, discussing their assets, their shared accounts, and the details of Mia's financial betrayal forced Ethan to relive the pain over and over. Each conversation felt heavier than the last, like a weight pressing down on his chest, making it harder to breathe. He had never realized how much of their life was intertwined until he had to start pulling it apart. The mortgage, the car, the savings accounts, everything they had built together now became a battlefield of numbers and paperwork. Ethan found himself agonizing over every detail, not because he wanted to hold on to things, but because it was another reminder of what he'd lost. Mia's responses during the process were as inconsistent as her excuses had been. Some days she seemed remorseful, apologizing profusely and insisting she wanted to make amends. Other days she was defensive, lashing out as though Ethan's decision to leave her was an act of cruelty. "I never wanted this," she said during one of their mediated sessions, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake, Ethan, but can't we fix it? Can't we try?" Ethan stared at her, the anger and heartbreak warring within him. "You didn't just make a mistake, Mia," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You made choices, over and over again, and those choices destroyed us." The mediator's pen scratched against paper, a quiet reminder of how clinical the process had become. This wasn't a fight between two people who loved each other anymore. It was a transaction, a division of what once was. And the loneliness that followed was its own kind of pain. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt cold and hollow. Ethan avoided the bedroom they had shared, opting instead to sleep on the couch most nights. He couldn't bring himself to clear out her things, the sight of them too much to bear. The silence, though, was the worst of it. It crept into every corner, amplifying his thoughts until they were all he could hear. Work became his refuge, a place where he could focus on something other than the ache in his chest. He threw himself into his projects, staying late at the office just to avoid coming home. But even there, he couldn't escape the pitying looks from coworkers who had heard whispers of his situation. "You're stronger than this," Jake had told him one evening over drinks, his tone unusually serious. "You'll get through it, Ethan. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but you will." Ethan wanted to believe him, but in those early weeks, it felt impossible. The grief was too heavy, the betrayal too raw. Time, though, had a way of softening the edges of pain. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan found himself slowly beginning to reclaim pieces of his life. He started running in the mornings, the rhythmic pounding of his feet against the pavement a temporary escape from his thoughts. He began cooking again, rediscovering the small joys of creating something for himself, no matter how simple. Small changes turned into bigger ones. He cleared out the bedroom, packing Mia's belongings into boxes and stacking them neatly by the door. It wasn't an act of anger or bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement that it was time to move forward. On a Saturday afternoon, he walked into the living room and stood in front of the wedding photo that had hung on the wall for years. He took it down, staring at the frozen smiles in the frame. For a moment, he felt a pang of sadness, but it was gentler now, less sharp than it had been. He placed the photo in a box with the others, a small step toward letting go. By the time the divorce was finalized, Ethan felt lighter. Not happy, not yet, but no longer crushed under the weight of what had happened. The legal proceedings were over, the accounts were settled, and the house was his alone. It was a bittersweet victory, one that didn't feel like winning so much as surviving. Standing in his empty living room that evening, Ethan took a deep breath. The house was quiet, but this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't oppressive or heavy. It was peaceful. He realized, for the first time in months, that he could breathe. The journey wasn't over. Ethan knew there would still be hard days, moments where the memories resurfaced and the pain felt fresh again. But he also knew he had made it through the worst of it. Slowly, he was learning to pick up the pieces, to build something new from the ruins of what had been. And for the first time, he allowed himself to hope. The first real step forward came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Ethan was running through the park, the brisk autumn air filling his lungs and the crunch of leaves beneath his shoes grounding him in the moment. It wasn't much, but it was a routine, a small piece of normalcy. He'd started running to clear his mind, and now it had become something he looked forward to, something just for him. At work, he threw himself into his projects with renewed focus. His team noticed the change, commenting on how driven and engaged he seemed. For the first time in months, Ethan found a sense of accomplishment in his work. The long hours weren't an escape anymore. They were a way to rebuild, to reclaim the parts of himself he'd lost. Outside the office, he began reconnecting with friends he hadn't seen in years. Jake had been a constant, but others came back into his life in unexpected ways. A casual text to an old college buddy turned into a weekend hiking trip. Dinner with a coworker became a monthly tradition. Slowly, the isolation that had consumed him after the divorce began to fade. One night, as he sat around a table with Jake and a few others at a local pub, Ethan caught himself laughing. Really laughing. For the first time in what felt like forever. The weight that had been pressing down on him for months felt lighter, almost distant. For the first time in years, he felt free. Not happy, not yet, but free. He began rediscovering the simple joys in life. A good book, a favorite song on the radio, the way the sun filtered through the trees during his morning run. Each small moment felt like a victory, a reminder that life didn't have to end where the pain began. It was a crisp November morning when Ethan found the letter in his mailbox. The envelope was plain, unremarkable, but the handwriting was neat and deliberate. Curious, he tore it open and unfolded the note inside. The words stopped him in his tracks. Ethan, I wanted to thank you, not just for what you exposed, but for how you handled it, with grace and dignity, even when it must have been unbearable. You didn't just open my eyes to James's lies, you gave me the courage to take control of my own life. I hope this letter finds you in a better place. If you ever want to talk or need someone who understands, I'd be happy to meet for coffee. Sometimes, the people who break us can lead us to those who help us heal. Rachel. Ethan reread the letter, his emotions a mix of surprise and gratitude. Rachel's words resonated deeply, not just because of what they shared, but because of what they had both endured. She was right. They had been broken, but maybe there was a chance to rebuild, to find strength in what remained. The idea of meeting Rachel felt strange, yet comforting. She wasn't just another person caught in the wreckage. She was someone who understood, someone who had fought her own battle in the shadow of betrayal. He folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope. That evening, as Ethan stood in front of the mirror brushing his teeth, he paused. For months, he had avoided his own reflection, unwilling to confront the pain etched into his face. Now, though, he saw something different. The lines of sorrow were still there, but so was something else. Strength, resilience, and the faintest glimmer of hope. Maybe the mirror wasn't shattered, he thought, setting the toothbrush down and smiling softly to himself. Maybe it just needed to be cleaned.